5 minutes.
Thanks, Concorda. First of all, to families that have lost a loved one, I think our condolences. I think we need to commend the frontline staff, nurses, doctor, catering staff, porters, cleaners. And I think we have also to remember the people that are bringing food around the country and medical necessities, the lorry drivers, the haulage sector, those that are keeping water going, electricity, shops and all of those. Minister, I think the student nurses issue has to be addressed urgently because we're in a crisis at the moment. It's a totally different Ireland than it was 6 weeks ago, and I think that needs to be looked at. In the line of the planning and the legislation you've brought in, Minister, I welcome a lot of it. On the planning side of it, Minister, I think that councils need to keep prioritising the likes of houses, not if you're building hotels or whatever. They're not needed at the moment. I think a lot of council staff can work from home, but it is also welcome that some of those things like hotels or whatever, the decisions can be left for a while. But Minister, it is also given powers to the Minister under the emergency laws to make decisions, and I think, Minister, I've brought this to note on an amendment that Bournemona cannot work this year unless you make a direct intervention. It was agreed that they would be working to the end of this year, and unless you make an intervention in the next couple of days, they are not able to work and they will have to close down. That is the reality of it. In the line of rents, Minister, I believe that it's nearly like going to sleep for 6 months. We need to make sure that renters haven't pressure put on them. I believe that the banks have to put it to the end of the mortgage for the landlords, and I believe that the PRTB, the landlord, the bank, this needs to be sort of a giant circle together to make sure that no one is shafting nobody. And in the line of students, Minister, and this is one thing, it may not be your department, but you're involved in it, it's still renting. There is students out there that paid for their accommodation in the end of January or the first week of January for the rest of the year. They are not now in college. There is also landlords that is ringing up the students looking for the last 2 months' rent. And I think that things like this has to be sorted. Minister, I welcome a lot of the things that you have brought in it. In the line, I welcome today as well that, fair play to the Gardaí or the police in the north, they have brought in a thug that spat at somebody, and it's about time. I'll tell you, I don't know, is it in through the course that should be brought? There's other ways that some of those people, what they're doing, it is disgusting, and they need to be dealt with, and dealt with hard in this country.
I welcome the opportunity to speak in relation to Section 25 of this bill today. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge the important contribution of the Defence Forces and indeed the entire Defence Organisation in support of the HSE in their effort to combat this very silent enemy. The most visible presence are the ships being used at testing centres in Dublin, Cork and Galway. A military task force has also been established to coordinate the support drawn from across all of the services and formations of the Defence Forces. Behind the scenes, huge efforts are being made by both civil and military staff to coordinate our actions, both administrative and logistical, to sustain the defence contribution to the whole of government effort. I also want to acknowledge the support and commitment of the Civil Defence Organisation in supporting the principal response agencies across the country. These volunteers and the civil defence officers are deserving of our praise and acknowledgement of their unwavering commitment in times of need. I had announced previously that the re-enlistment of former PDF personnel was one of the range of initiatives to address capability gaps in the Permanent Defence Force. Last December, I brought a draft bill to Government which provided for the re-enlistment of former enlisted personnel, which was published last January as part of the Defence Amendment Bill 2020. I previously commenced a scheme for commissioned officers to return to service. In the past year, a number of former pilots have returned to serve in the Air Corps. There is also scope to recommission officers in other specialist streams across the Defence Force organisation where shortages exist. While the officers can be recommissioned under the provisions of the Defence Act, there is no such provision under which enlisted personnel can re-enlist. I am aware that there are former enlisted personnel wishing to return to the organisation, and I was determined to facilitate this. The COVID crisis has added urgency, hence the inclusion of this provision in today's bill. The intention is that the provision will be used to enlist suitably qualified, experienced former enlisted persons in the PDF to fill key specialised appointments. The provision is identical to Section 4 of the published Defence Amendment Bill 2020. The scheme is targeted at former enlisted persons who have completed a full term of their original enlistment, including any required service with the Reserve Defence Force, who has been discharged by purchase. There may be former members who wish to re-enlist for a short period to answer the call to support COVID-19 response. There will also be those who wish to re-enlist for the full 3 years. Therefore, the facility will be to enlist for a minimum of 6 months, but up to 3 years. There may be an option to extend further service once the period is completed, subject to vacancies existing and the Chief of Staff recommending it. Those wishing to be considered for re-enlistment will be able to register their interest on military.ie. Work is ongoing to put this in place, and it is planned to go live early next week. Full terms and conditions will also be available to view at this point. Turning to the Reserve Defence Force, the Government appreciates the service of the members of the RDF, which comprises the First Line Reserve, the Army Reserve and the Naval Service Reserve. In terms of the calls on resources to the Defence Forces at this time, a necessity for a general call-out to reserve has not arisen. Some reservists who have skills which are required in COVID-19 response and whose personnel circumstances allow them to do so are already undertaking certain tasks on a voluntary basis, including support to the civil authorities, and I welcome their contribution. Members of the reserve are paid in such circumstances. When I visited LE George Bernard Shaw yesterday to see the excellent work and the great contribution done by the Defence Forces, I was delighted to hear that members of the Naval Service Reserve are on board assisting with the COVID-19 response. And I also confirmed today that following discussions with the Chief of Staff and the GOCs are activating the reserve to assist with the Defence Forces' contribution to our national effort. I would encourage qualified ex-members of the Defence Forces to consider re-enlistment, particularly at this very difficult time in our lives, and I look forward to welcoming them back as part of the Irish Defence Forces family. Thank you very much.